Hello, everyone. So am I live yet? Yes. Just so I know who I'm speaking to, anyone out there who is a musician, please raise their hands. I love it. Anyone out there who does a lot of work in acoustics research, please raise your hand. All right. Anyone out there who just is here because they love architecture? That's fantastic. All right. My father was an engineer. My mother was an English teacher. From the time that I was in first grade, there's documented proof that I wanted to design buildings. I've sung in church choirs since I was in third grade. I first performed on a stage when I was in fourth grade. I did Hamlet. So it might be more accurate to say I moved around the stage and said lines. But I have been interested in the field that I came into from multiple directions from very early on. When I went off to college, I studied architectural engineering rather than architecture, which is a discipline that combines architecture, mechanical engineering, structural engineering, electrical, lighting design, all these different aspects of design, including acoustics. I had 2 courses. I graduated and knew after those 2 courses that what I wanted to do was not architecture, but acoustics consulting, working with architects to shape their designs so that they sounded good. And I was fortunate enough to get hired at Kirkegaard Associates, and I've been there now 30 years. I came in fresh out of college. I now own the place. This is what happens when you stay in one place too long. Let's see. My particular background with this interest in architecture and this knowledge of performance from the performing side, and with the sort of technical background of an engineering degree, has left me in a good position to do consulting. I'm not a researcher, but I value what researchers do in providing us with information that can be applied to design. I'm not an architect, but I work happily with architects and I respect what they do. More than anything, we are hired for a body of expertise and a sense of judgment. We work with architects making suggestions for things they need to do to shape a room, and they come back with how to integrate this into a design. And so those are the sorts of terms in which I'm going to be talking about our design work today. And there will be time for questions at the end, assuming I don't talk too long, which I promise not to do. When we talk about acoustics, there are 4 broad topics of acoustics. There's isolation, which is when you are in a room, how do we make sure that you're not distracted by what's going on outside the room? There is noise control. When you are in a room, how do we make sure that the air conditioning system is not so noisy it's interfering with what you're trying to do? And in a room like this, it's essentially silent, which is appropriate. There is audio-video design. I have people who do audio-video design. I am not one of them. Anyone who helped me set this up today knows that I definitely am not an audio-video designer. But I understand the way that sound comes out of loudspeakers and how to shape a room to work well with the sound from the loudspeakers. And the 4th big topic is what we're talking about here today and what you probably think of as acoustics, room acoustics. How does sound bounce around inside a room, and how does that make you feel about what you're hearing? An important thing to remember about room acoustics is that there is no such thing as an acoustically perfect room. There's no such thing as a room that has great acoustics, period. Acoustics matters relative to what you're doing in the room. A great concert hall that has great acoustics for hearing a symphony orchestra is a crummy place acoustically for seeing a play. A place that's really wonderful for an intimate connection with an actor on stage who is doing a stage whisper without a microphone is likely not to be a very good place for hearing a 100-voice choir perform. So whenever we're starting to do the design of a room, our starting point is, what do you want to do in the room, and what kind of sound, what kind of acoustics is going to serve that function well? So, when we were hired to design the new music multimedia research room, we asked Kermit and McGill, what do you want to do in this room? And the answer is everything, which is an interesting challenge in itself. Well, everything boiled down to a whole lot of acoustics research. And what is that? Well, we don't know. It could be almost anything. And in addition, there would be performances in there, recitals. And in addition, they might put an orchestra in there to rehearse, or smaller groups to rehearse. So research for sure, sometimes recitals, sometimes rehearsals. You're not doing plays in there, for which I'm grateful. So what we did was to use a room that we had designed that had a similar research function, but also think about how the recital and rehearsal uses might influence that design. And so for my talk today, I want to run you through 3 case studies and then end up with a presentation of the MMR, of the room for McGill. And those 3 case studies are a recital hall, a rehearsal room, and the room for research that was the direct model for the MMR. Before I get into acoustics specifically, I'd like to talk about sound itself for a moment. The acoustics people may now roll their eyes or go to sleep or whatever, and the rest of you can listen. Sound is vibration. Typically when we're dealing with it, it's air molecules vibrating. And those vibrations travel away from the source, and as they travel away, they expand. As they expand, the amount of energy in any little sliver of that ever-expanding sphere gets spread over a larger area, so the farther you get away from a source, the quieter it is. Duh. You all know this. When you are listening to a source out in an open field, you pretty much are just hearing the sound from the source. Now, that sound has a couple of characteristics that are of interest to us. Sound travels at a certain speed in air, and it might differ a little bit depending on exactly how dense the air is and all of that, but it's basically consistent. And for our rule of thumb, you can think of sound as traveling 1 foot every millisecond, every thousandth of a second. Technically, it's like 1.1 foot, but within the context of a room, we find it useful to say every millisecond, sound travels 1 foot. So if you're 50 milliseconds away from me, the sound, if you're 50 feet away from me, the sound is taking 50 milliseconds to reach you. If there is a reflection that is coming off that wall and reaching you, and that reflection is a 70-foot reflection, then that reflection is reaching you 20 milliseconds after the direct. If you hear me use the term path length difference, that's what I mean. The direct takes that long, the reflection takes that long, the difference between them, path length difference. A very important concept as we get into thinking about these rooms. So there is time. There's also frequency. We're able to hear frequencies as low as 20 hertz, or even lower than that because I can't produce 20 hertz. We can hear frequencies as high as 20,000 hertz, even higher than that because I can't produce 20,000. Those wavelengths have physical size. A low frequency wavelength is huge. It's 20, 30 feet maybe, depending on the frequency. A high frequency wavelength is tiny. It is fractions of an inch. The size of the wavelength matters because the surfaces that these wavelengths, that these sound waves are reflecting off of will look different to the sound wave depending on the physical size of the wave and the amount of physical undulation in the surface. A huge concrete wall with a smooth surface will look the same to a low frequency wave, a mid frequency wave, or a high frequency wave. That same surface made out of split face CMU with this, kind of rough textured stucco-like finish, to a low frequency sound wave, wavelengths like that, that wall is exactly the same whether it's rough textured or completely smooth. To a mid frequency sound wave, wavelengths about like this, that rough textured concrete and the smooth concrete look pretty similar. The sound wave will reflect off them fairly similarly. To a high frequency sound wave, where the wavelengths are like that, an amount of texture with that kind of thickness is visible to that high frequency sound wave. And instead of reflecting off the wall like a billiard ball off of a table, it may be scattered by that roughness. When we talk about diffusion, that's what we're talking about, that random scattering because of the texture of the surface relative to the size of the wavelength. Last thing that I want to talk about in sort of introducing sound itself, timbre. If you got another baritone up here speaking and you closed your eyes, you'd be able to tell us apart easily. If you had a violinist up here playing a high C and a flute up here playing the exact same note, you would easily, with your eyes closed, be able to say whether the violin or the flute was performing. The fundamental pitch is the same, but each of those instruments is producing a whole series of overtones. They're producing a lot of very high frequencies marching up from there. And it is those overtones that give each sound its characteristic timbre. Therefore, what you do with very high frequencies in a room matters a great deal because it has a lot to do with how we perceive the timbre of instruments. Okay, so that's sound. That's just sound in itself. We rarely listen to sound in open fields very much. We are almost always dealing with sound in a room. And when I talk about room acoustics, it fundamentally, basically comes down to how does sound bounce around in a room between a source and a listener. I mean, that's acoustics. How does the sound bounce around in the room? So we find it helpful to think of the reflection structure of the room, the patterns of reflections, and there's sort of 4 vocabulary elements I'm going to give you in talking about reflection structure. There's support. These are reflections that your ear adds to the direct in a way that makes the direct sound more robust, more interesting, and just, stronger and more engaging. All reflections that reach your ear within 50 milliseconds, all reflections that have a path length of 50 milliseconds or less are basically supportive. Reflections that come in after 50 milliseconds are likely to be supportive as long as they're not too loud. Why 50 milliseconds? Somewhere around 50 milliseconds, your brain says, wait, that's not the direct sound, that's a reflection. And if that reflection is loud enough, the brain notices it too much, overlaps it on the direct sound, and gets confused. That overlapped sound is an echo. Echoes are confusing. When we are designing rooms, we get obsessive about finding possible echoes and treating surfaces to reduce their strength, so instead of being echoes, they're just support of some kind. Most of these supportive reflections and potential echoes are happening in a fairly tight time frame. We're usually concerned about support and concerned about echoes in the first, we'll say, 200 milliseconds, the first fifth of a second after someone makes a sound. But in most rooms that we occupy, the sound does not vanish in a fifth of a second. Most rooms that we occupy, the sound takes longer to trail off. That is reverberation. The image that may be useful to have in your head. You're in a recital hall, you're in a concert hall, you're getting sound direct from the performer. That first direct sound is the first sound you hear, it's the loudest sound you hear. Then you're getting reflections off the stage front, off the side walls, off that corner, off the ceiling, off the wall behind you. All of those reflections, 1 bounce, 2 bounces, are support, and if they're too strong, echoes. But eventually you're getting reflections that have bounced off 5 or 6 surfaces, and that are dying away, they're spreading, they're losing energy every time they hit a surface, and the energy in the room is just gradually dying off. That is reverberation. Reverberation ties music together, it smooths things out. People tend to like reverberant rooms. Particularly for music, we want reverberation, but not too much of it. Like acoustics itself, reverberation wants to be tailored to what's happening in the room, and there are ranges of reverberation appropriate to different uses, and the size of a room also affects that. So a target reverberation time for a small room will naturally be lower. A target reverberation time for a larger room will naturally be higher. The last term up there is flutter. Flutter is a particular kind of echo. You've all experienced it. You're walking down a narrow corridor with 2 flat walls. You say something and you hear this twang, twang, twang. If you happen to be in a room with narrow parallel walls and you clapped, you would hear a that's flutter. Sound trapped between parallel surfaces, rattling back and forth. Harsh, confusing, nasty. I feel about flutter roughly as I feel about echoes. I don't like it. Okay. So I'd like to give you a few visuals for some of these things. At least they're visuals for those of you who like charts. When we're testing a room, we will go and set up a loudspeaker in the middle of the stage and hook up a computer to it and send a sweep tone to it. We'll have a microphone out in the audience connected to the same computer, listening to the reflections that reach the microphone. And because the computer knows what it sent out, it can read what it got back and give us a pretty accurate understanding of the reflections in the room. And this is one of the graphs that we deal with most often. The very first high peak is the direct sound. You can see that there was a very strong reflection that had about a 20-foot path difference, probably a ceiling reflection. And then you can see that the general slope of this just sort of dies down fairly evenly. This is a nice sounding room. It's a reverberant room, and you can tell it's reverberant because the slope is fairly flat. If it were a drier room, the slope would be much steeper. It's not a dead flat series of reflections, but everything is mostly quieter than what came before. Not a lot of echoes, happy, nice room. If we zero in on the first two blocks up there, that's the first 200 milliseconds. Those are the early reflections where we really define the character of the room. The one on the left is that same graph looking just at the first 200 milliseconds. And you can see again, the direct is pretty high. There's a strong reflection at about 20 milliseconds. That's wonderful support, and it just gradually tails off. Compare it to the one on the right, which is a different room. Big gap between 0 and 40 milliseconds. Not a lot of supportive reflections. Now, thank heavens that big first reflection is coming in at 40 milliseconds. If that was coming in at 60 milliseconds, your first major reflection would be an echo, and that would be an unsupported, unclear, unhappy room. Here it's at 40, it's okay, but look at those two little bumps immediately to the right of that 40 millisecond thing. There are a couple of echoes at, about 60 and 70 milliseconds. Not real great. So if we're looking to analyze an existing room, we'll do this sort of thing to find problems with the reflection pattern. Similarly with flutter, same graph on the left that you're familiar with. This is the worst example of flutter that we have ever measured in our lives. I think it's the back of Royal Festival Hall in London, where the super wide, flat parallel walls and the sound just went whoop, 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 whoop between the walls. And you can see those regularly repeated echoes marching down that slope. It's a truly horrific example. Most of the data that you're going to see today, in fact, all of it, I think, is unoccupied data. It's easier to measure rooms when there aren't people in them, but what we care about is the rooms with people in them. Always keep that in mind. This particular graph shows the same room measured with and without people. You can see the blue without people and the red with. The sound dies away more quickly, steeper slope, shorter reverberation time. Typically, you'll lose 0.2 to 0.3 seconds by filling a room with people, though that depends on where in the room you are sustaining your reverberation. You can achieve a similar result by adding movable absorptive materials to a room. If you want to give a room a broader range of reverberation times, you can add curtains, add banners. And this is a measurement of adding one large curtain to this recital hall that we were measuring. final introductory thing I want to do is to talk a little more about texture. You remember talking about how different textures are visible at to different sizes of wavelengths. Because overtones matter so much in a room, the way that you handle the texture in a room has a lot to do with how you perceive a room. Control rooms for recording are often designed with a lot of high-frequency scattering in them because it sort of makes the room disappear perceptually. I have worked with a professor at University of Michigan who is blind and in the acoustics program. And she described walking into the recording room and finding it sort of disorienting because she could not sense how big the room was. Now, often when we're trying to address echoes, prevent echoes, rather than putting an absorptive treatment on the surface, which would steal energy from the room, we want to put a diffusive treatment on a surface so that an echo, instead of being a sharp, loud, confusing reflection, is scattered and just contributes to general reverberation. But we need to be careful that the approach we take to diffusing the sound does not color the sound, does not make things harsh. We worked on a renovation in Des Moines, and the architect liked this panel on the left. It was cool, it fit well architecturally. We said, great, we got a sample. We put it into our room where there's a baffle in the middle of the room, and we have a loudspeaker on one side, and we stand on the other, and we can listen and hear sound bounce off the panel, and there's no direct sound from the loudspeaker. Great way of getting a sense of what sound sounds like bouncing off of a surface. One on the left with lots of little cupped divots and lots of little edges, a lot of very high frequency diffraction and concentrated little spitty reflections. Ick. Very harsh, very unpleasant. We listened to pink noise off of it. We listened to a recording of violin off of it. Not a happy sound. The same manufacturer had a diffusive panel that was softly folded plates with slightly rounded edges where the plates met. You can see that on the right. Diffused sound very nicely, mellow character, really very pleasant. That's the one we used, and they are thrilled with the room. So, 3 room types that I want to touch on. First example, a recital hall. For this particular project, for Northwestern University, it was a competition, so we had to get hired first. We worked with an architect, and their competition-winning design left this trapezoidal shape, this trapezoidal box for our recital hall. A little wider than I wish it was, not the best shape, but we ended up making it work. To win the competition, the owner had signaled that they really wanted a big glass window at the back of the stage looking down Lake Michigan. We said, great, glass window, we'll do it. In a recital hall, it's all about providing a lot of supportive reflections, having enough volume that you can develop reverberation, but not so much that it's too reverberant or that you lose the energy of one musician on stage producing a pianissimo that you want to really carry. Or doing a fortissimo and you don't want it to blow the lid off the room. So it needs sort of the right amount of volume. The surfaces need to be close enough in that you have lots of supportive reflections. You need to be very careful about flutter and echo, as you always are. This room is about 430 seats. It's large, it's on the large size for typical recital halls. You can see in the section of the room outlined in pink that we have a basically flat ceiling, but not literally flat. It's got these long sweeping curves. And you can see the single balcony at the back of the room on the left in this image. and the slightly raised stage on the right. You may notice as well that the glass upstage wall leans back 2 or 3 degrees. This has the effect of letting it behave just like a vertical wall for a single reflection, but for multiple interreflections, where the rear wall of the room and the upstage wall are talking to each other, the multiple interreflections tend to get kicked up in the room, which we found useful for keeping a clean sound on stage. We deliberately shaped these ceiling panels so that everyone in the audience, whether the main floor or the balcony, gets a single strong reflection from overhead. There are points in the audience where you get a reflection off of each of the 2 parts of the ceiling, but you're not getting 4 or 5 reflections from overhead. You're getting 1 strong or 2 strong, clean reflections from overhead. The sound on stage in a recital hall matters enormously. Musicians are not machines. If we give them a space where they can feel comfortable performing, they will perform better. So, what's involved in being comfortable on stage? Part of it is that you need well-timed reflections that send your own sound back to you, not as an echo, and send the sound of the people next to you back to you, not as an echo. So the ceiling over the stage we kept just low enough that the reflections back are coming in as supportive reflections, not as echoes. We were concerned about the upper corner at the back of the stage, so we shaped that to scatter and diffuse the reflection that would otherwise come back. We were concerned about the reflections from the back of the room, so we heavily sculpted the lower rear wall and the upper rear wall so that the reflections are not coming back as a slap back, but as a sort of a wash of sound. The musicians on stage need that sense of their sound coming back not instantly, but with some delay. Room response is the term that we use for it. That room response gives the musicians useful feedback so they can relax and know that their sound is getting out there. In a room that is otherwise perfectly supportive, if the rear wall is not designed correctly to give that room response, even though the musician is heard beautifully by the audience, they may not feel it, and it will affect their performance. So, to give this room response without an echo, we have this undulating rear wall treatment that's pretty strongly undulating so that the sound is spread by the convex part, and then the concave parts concentrate the sound very close to the wall, after which it again spreads. We have some subtle little things where at the undersides of most of these curves, there is a little bit of thin wool felt, which is absorptive at very high frequencies. The very high frequencies are the most confusing part of an echo, and we've found that by treating potential echo surfaces with that thin fuzz, we can give a sense of sound returning without as much clatter or confusion. So wherever we had a right angle corner, curved wall, flat overhang that would otherwise zip a little high frequency back to stage, we just shaved it off a little bit. Now, I mentioned the shape of this room is not ideal. It used to be that concert halls were all basically parallel walled rooms. The sort of 17th and 18th century, that was typical. And that sustained sound very nicely. And because they were masonry rooms, plaster and masonry, and they were not built by people with laser transits, they weren't ever exactly parallel, so they would sustain sound but not generally get too fluttery. In the 1930s, 40s, 50s, people realized, oh, we can take those walls and make them fan-planned and get more people close to the stage, and that will make the rooms much better. Nobody until, and the creation of performance halls with widely splayed sidewalls revealed the importance of lateral reflections. Because our ears are on the side of the head, it matters a great deal that we get reflections from the side walls of the hall and not just from overhead. And in a widely splayed room, in a fan-plan room, sidewall reflections tend to end up in the back corners. So for architectural reasons, we were starting with a mildly fan-plan room, and what we did was to come in with interior shaping that made the walls at the stage more projective, so we didn't build up too much energy on stage, and then took the walls in the middle of the room and made them less projective, almost but not quite parallel, so that the reflections off of those would come further forward in the room. Then the sidewalls at the far back of the room are even more regressive, and the net result is that no matter where you are in the room, you always get at least one and sometimes two reflections off the sidewalls. Of course, we love the balcony too, so we made sure that a similar thing was happening for the balcony. As you look at the sidewall of this room, you'll notice that there are a lot of areas that are simple, smooth curves, flanking the stage, and the lower walls flanking the audience. It is our opinion that providing very clean early reflections off these surfaces, the ceiling, lower side walls, and the surfaces near the performers, help people to get an accurate image of the sound being produced. But if we were to carry those simple, smooth surfaces all the way up on the side walls, the room would probably end up clattery, overbright, not literally fluttery, but kind of fluttery sounding. So the room gets more diffusive, a little busier on the upper side walls in the part of the room that naturally sustains reverberation longest. And of course, we continue that shaping around on the rear wall so that we can have sound returning to the room response for the musicians, and envelopment for the audience, and freedom from echoes. Sometimes we want less reverberation in the room, and in that situation, it is useful to bring in some adjustable absorption. In this case, wool surge banners that drop down automatically in the zone of the side walls that most sustains reverberation, and at the rear wall to knock down the reflections that are coming back from the rear wall. Let's say if you were doing a trumpet in there rather than a singer. Singers like a lot of rear wall response, trumpeters not so much. With these banners, we are able to reduce reverberation and also modify the reflections coming back. You'll notice that we are not entirely covering those surfaces. We are adding some absorption to a diffusive zone, but still letting some reflections come back. We measured reverberation time in this room with curtains and banners fully pocketed and with various amounts of curtains and banners exposed. These are all unoccupied measurements. The room at mid-frequencies is a little more than 1.5 seconds with the curtains retracted, and around 1.2 seconds with the curtains exposed, similar to the effect you might get if you stuffed it full of people. And they find that they use those banners for every performance to adjust it to sort of hit the sweet spot for that particular kind of performance. So, quick summary of a recital hall. Ample volume so that you don't get too loud and you can develop reverberation. Not too much volume because you want a single performer to be able to energize the room. Supportive reflections, both to the audience and back to the performer. Tightly timed supportive reflections on stage. Later timed diffusive reflections back from the room as room response. Some variability to deal with a wider range of instruments, and some diffusion, but not too much. Rehearsal room. In a rehearsal room, you are putting a large ensemble. And even in a very large rehearsal room like this, a massively sized ensemble can come close to filling it. But we try to leave at least some breathing room behind the conductor and in front of the strings so that musicians who would normally be at the front of the stage addressing a big room full of air are not getting a reflection coming back at them in an artificially close time frame. You can see that there is a series of reflectors overhead, curtains, and a mixture of absorption and reflection on the side walls. Again, we need a fairly large volume in this room so it doesn't get too loud. When we've seen rehearsal rooms where the ceiling is too low, there's a real danger of them overloading. Or if you stuff them full of absorption so they don't get too loud, they're kind of disappointingly dead. Here, we've made the ceiling absorptive for loudness control. It's a fairly high ceiling, similar to what we had in the recital hall, but there is an array of clouds that is lower than that for really good communication within the ensemble. Our preference for an array of clouds in a rehearsal room is that they have breathing room between them, so sound can get up through them into the upper volume. They are slightly curved so that the reflection from one reflector and the reflection from the adjacent reflector provides even, just barely overlaps to provide even coverage so that any person in the ensemble is getting an overhead reflection from any other person in the ensemble. One of the big concerns in a rehearsal room is that they're putting out really too much sound, and if you allow it to build up right where the musician's ears are, it's going to get uncomfortable, painful, opaque. They won't hear each other as well as they should, even with good overhead reflections. So we like to treat the lower zone of our rehearsal rooms so that built-up sound is naturally pushed up and away from the musicians. We do this by coming in with secondary walls, you can see a detail on the right, that lean back very gently. If this were a marching band rehearsal room, it would lean back less subtly and more dramatically to get that reflected energy up and away from the musicians even sooner. Lean back gently and have some absorption on them so that the very late reflections from a musician at the east end of the room, their sound going off the wall at the west and coming back, is not a confusing echo. So what we did in this room, once again responding to the architecture, the blue lines show the areas where we have that leaning back wall, that battered wall, where architecturally they did not want that in the left-hand side of the room. we did thicker absorption on the wall. That's the heavy red line towards the upper left. In the rest of the room, we had thinner absorption on the wall. Again, thin absorption, thin fuzz, takes out the most confusing part of a reflection, but still leaves the core of the sound. And then on two of the walls, at the right and at the lower wall, there are curtains in the lower zone that can be bunched up or exposed depending on how loud the room is and what orientation you're using it in. Very easy to move. In the upper zone of the room, we have nearly half of the wall covered with these slightly shaped wood reflectors, shown in blue here, that act as curtain pockets for the curtains, shown in red here, so that we can cover half the walls in the upper zone with curtains, or we can push the curtains back into the pockets and expose hard wall there. But the hard wall is facing a wood pocket that is shaped gently top to bottom, is shaped gently side to side, and also has some irregularity in it for random diffusion, so that those walls will talk to each other, but not in a harsh, chattery kind of way. We measured reverberation in this with the curtains exposed and pocketed. It ranges from about 1.2 seconds down to 0.7 seconds. 0.7 is pretty dry. So to recap, enough volume for loudness control, enough volume that you can build up some reverberation, but less reverberation than for a recital. More attention to loudness control, especially down where the musicians are, and we achieve it here by angling walls in a way that directs sustained sound up and away from the musicians. In the upper zone of the room, we have diffusive treatments, the wood things, and absorption, movable, so that the sustain of sound can be adjusted. Third example, a space for research. The MPAC Center at RPI had a very generous donor, and is a pretty spectacular facility with a 1,200-seat concert hall, a theater, 2 research spaces, the larger of which was the model for the MMR. It's a pretty simple box. It's very tall, about 45 feet tall, and it is covered with sound diffusing panels, so that what comes off of these surfaces has a lot of high frequency diffusion that dematerializes the room. It also, through some mechanism, is mildly absorptive, even though it doesn't have materials that you would normally think of as absorptive. And you can see this round thing hanging in the room. That's a temporary installation. Overhead, there is a tension wire grid, a trampoline, that you can walk on and hang things through, whether that's lights or rigging lines or such. The diffusive panels were a custom design that we came up with. They're bowed so that they spread sound at mid-frequencies. There are some of them, the darker ones, that are sound absorptive, mixed in with the sound diffusive ones. And the high-frequency scattering on the face is achieved through a whole bunch of shallow drilled holes at all sorts of different sizes and very random. Behind these are a series of bass traps, boxes that are deliberately designed to absorb various low frequencies, because the basic room is a concrete block box, And if we didn't have those bass absorbers, the room would be really boomy. Here's a view from the trampoline. You can see the big gaps that you can drop rigging through, and tools if you're inclined. And then you can actually light right through the metal mesh that people will be walking on. There is one of these planned for the MMR, so I wanted specifically to show it. In addition to the basic diffusive treatments, there are also wool serge banners that can be dropped down in front of the diffusion so that you can take this diffusive surface and turn it off. In this particular hall, in order to get greater depth of absorption, there are two sets of banners that operate one right behind the other to really thoroughly turn off the sidewalls. Measured reverberation time. The most live the room ever gets is less than 1 second. And adding the banners drops it down to about 0.6 seconds. This was what this particular client wanted. They were never intending to make music in here. They just wanted this. Our client's description of what he wanted was to be in a clearing in a forest with that sense of a bit of sound coming back, but you're basically in an open space. Overhead, the ceiling is completely fuzzed out with deep fuzz, and that carries down to the side walls from the trampoline level on up. So very dry, very fuzzy room, but not anechoic. And there you see it with one of the setups that they can do in there. So, recap, heavily diffused, a sense of something coming back to you, but not distinct in any particular way, and careful bass absorption. Your room was modeled on that one. It is a slightly larger footprint. It is almost literally the same height. At the time this was built, there was not money to finish it out, so the isolation design and the noise control design was executed in full, but the room acoustic design was just set aside, and basically to make it workable, you hung curtains in it. The catwalks, no, sorry, I'll get there. At the main floor, our acoustic design is trying to stay tight against the walls as much as possible to maximize the amount of floor area open to you. And whether it's used for a research setup, whatever that might be, or whether it's used for a recital, or whether it's used for a chamber orchestra rehearsal, or whether you turn that orchestra 90 degrees and put in a full-sized orchestra, there is physically room to fit a wide variety of uses in there. In the middle level of the room, because we didn't want to pay for double tiers of banners, but we still wanted the banners to make a full frequency difference in the room, we chose to pull the banners farther away from the walls in the upper part of the room. One of the things that we found at MPAC was that this textured surface was all great on the side walls, but sometimes the users had to attach things to the side walls. And so they retrofitted unistrut between the diffusive elements. But when you drop the banners in front of it, you can't really use the unistrut. So we did not want to repeat that condition here. And we came up with what we've dubbed the buttresses, which basically are elements that hang out from the walls, vertical metal things that you can attach to that are farther forward even than the banners. And then there is a trampoline in this space. The dotted pink line shows the level of the trampoline. It's below the catwalk system that was initially put in so that people can flow easily through it. Depending on how the sidewalls are lighted, you will be more or less aware of this. As at MPAC, there is extensive absorption in the upper part of the room, but not 100% absorption up there. There's a lot of round ductwork in both rooms that sends some sound scattering back. And because your targets for reverberation were longer for this room than they were at MPAC, we did not want to obliterate the overhead reflections. Another thing that we were challenged by is that the recital and the rehearsal uses suffer from not having reflectors overhead. You remember our recital design, you remember our rehearsal design. We like having reflectors overhead for that. But for research, we don't want reflections coming back from above that could interfere with whatever you're trying to measure. With the trampoline, you can hang a temporary reflector if you choose to. But if you don't want to go to that much trouble, we have added some reflectors along the side walls of the hall, halfway up the wall, that will send additional reflections back to an orchestra or to an audience or to performers on stage. And we have made provisions, when you can afford them, for rolling towers, recital screens that can be set behind performers to provide additional reflections for those uses. So here's a rendering of the room. It's got diffusive panels with bass traps behind them, as at MPAC. It has the buttresses hanging off the wall, giving the room greater flexibility to hang things, whether this is loudspeakers or special diffusive elements or whatever the heck you want to hang there, you can do it. You can see the reflective shelf running around the middle of the room, and an array of loudspeakers that can be hung around the room for a virtual environment sort of situation. The lower part of the room has a manual curtain, similar to what I described for the rehearsal room at University of Michigan, so that you can turn off the reflections that are closest to the musicians without having to bring down all the banners all the way to the floor, which is what they have to do at MPAC. You still have banners at the upper side walls. You could choose to do every other banner like this, so that there's still some sense of life in the upper zone of the room, but that you're controlling it more. Or you can turn the room off pretty completely. The side walls, lower zone in the room, we have a smaller scale 2x2 panel, diffusive panel, and it's all diffusion with that curtain to pull in front of it when you want it to go away. Upper zone of the room, 3x3 panels. Saves us some money to have fewer panels. And at that zone, there isn't as much need for diffusion. As at MPAC, there are some absorptive panels mixed in with the diffusive panels. And then the ability for banners to come down and cover it all. We had some fun designing these diffusive panels. We worked very closely with MSDL, the architect for this fit-out, on the design of something that they were, I would say, content with aesthetically, and that still had the randomness, the smoothness, and the mellow character that we were looking for in these. And the idea of bubbles came up, and we, using the Grasshopper computer program, came up with a whole bunch of iterations of bubbly panels. We did a mock-up of those, and we will be able to orient these in any of 4 orientations on the walls for even greater randomness in the room. And we did listening tests to compare it to an MPAC panel, and we're very pleased that the character is even a little smoother and a little milder than the MPAC panel. To confirm that we were getting close to the targets, we did a computer model of the room and assigned absorption characteristics and diffusion characteristics to that model. To start with, we measured the room as you were used to using it, with the curtains in it. That is the black and the green line, which is the same condition measured 2 different ways. The blue line is our computer model of the room after the finishes are added with the curtains removed. The ones up at the top are a measurement of the room after the curtains were pulled out, and our computer model of the room after the curtains were pulled out, which we calibrated to match, and then used as the basis for the rest of the design. And the red shows the lower limit of what we can achieve when you bring in all of the curtains in the room. We are really excited about this room. It should be flexible. It should give you a nice neutral palette when you need it, but still have some presence for the sort of musical uses, whether rehearsal or recital. And there will be just a lot of flexibility built into this thing. Plus, I think it's going to be a handsome room, which matters. Thank you all very much.